Okay, let's continue. And bear with me because my computer is moving kind of slowly. So I have to start again here. With this much preparation behind us, let's now interpret the symbols. So pardon me for repeating a little bit of this. Persons bound in the chairs are ordinary citizens or subjects without real access to power. The bonds that keep them fixed in their chairs and their heads facing one direction are, I say, the opinions, which are produced by a combination of the shadows on the back wall and the sounds produced by the persons manipulating the puppets or objects in front of the fire. These persons are politicians and rhetoricians, or as we would say, PR experts and spin doctors, who skillfully generate the shadow images on the back wall of the cave. Now, one can only generate shadow images if there is a source of illumination. Socrates tells us that this is a roaring fire behind the puppeteers, I'll call them. What does the fire represent? As the sun outside the cave represents the idea of the good, the fire may represent the sun itself. That's the natural reading. But I'll just go with this for a moment. But that does not help us understand the relation between the fire, the puppeteers, and the puppets. The messages of rhetoricians, politicians, propagandists, and spin doctors are not illuminated by the sun. Does that make any sense? So I think we have at least a reason and there should be S-U-N. I think we have a reason. I guess I have to fix that for your sake. Let's do this, that, and all right, we're back in business. Of course, rhetoricians and spin doctors are quite free to rent a billboard, right? In which case, the billboard would be illuminated by the sun, but their ideas and their statements are not illuminated by the sun. So let's just try a different way of thinking about this. I propose that we understand the fire to represent the human passions, particularly desire, but not merely desire, as it is in the light of the passions that all those who do not govern their lives by reason see the beings, that is, the things of this world. I'm going to say that again because that's really important, because whether my interpretation is correct or not, this is true. It is in the light of the passions that all those who do not govern their lives by reason see the beings. And that's true by definition, because if they're not governing their lives by reason, they have placed themselves at the disposal of their passions, and their passions then dominate. Okay. So Socrates points out, so think about the fire possibly as the passions, and the passions themselves as containing a kind of interpretive key relative to which things appear in a certain way. For example, if a person is someone who desires lots of money, he tends to perceive people as opportunities for making money, right? A person who is a person who has a very strong desire for food maybe no longer takes interest in persons, or maybe sees them as potential dinner partners. They go out to eat somewhere, right? So someone who is a proud person gets angry very easily at any perceived slight, even if you haven't really slighted the person. You've all had that experience. So Socrates' point then would be that rhetoricians and their students bring forth images and concepts that, as a matter of course, are interpreted by the light of the passions. That's the point. They know that. The result is that the members of the audience are never in direct contact with the beings, with the things of this world, with facts, with reality, but only in contact with how these beings appear in light of A, their passions, desire, fear, wrath, pride, sorrow, joy, disgust, satisfaction, etc., right? And pride is a bit more complicated because it includes an opinion built into it, but sort of a wrath plus an opinion. And in light of B, these opinions, or pardon me, these passions as manipulated through the skilled use of language used in accordance with a technique that's studied and practiced over a long period of time, to the point where you can use that technique to influence people and control them even, right? So we learned in the sheep shepherd speech from book 1 that one of the principal devices of the rhetorician is to stir up competitive feelings of envy, fear, hatred, and the desire to dominate, right? So he was pointing out, Thrasymachus was pointing out to persons there in the household of Cephalus that, look, the unjust man always gets the worst whenever he comes into the just man always gets the worst when he comes into contact with the unjust man. Do you want to be on the losing end, right? Is what he's saying. Do you want to be the loser or the winner? Okay, so that's one of the techniques, if not the technique, of rhetoricians. So one thinks, I think, immediately of MSNBC on the one hand and Fox News on the other, and how they spare no effort at representing half the country as a monstrous enemy in need of being crushed, but never identified with as fellow citizens, and still less regarded with patience and compassion as human beings who have their faults, just as we do, we the consumers of either MSNBC or Fox, because the consumer of one tends not to be the consumer of the other. Neither. Do you see how mainstream media, even if once in a while a fact actually gets through, do a grave disservice to our country, grave disservice to our national community of sorts, community in an extended sense, right? I haven't met most of the 330 million people who live here, by continuously priming people to hate one another, to fight, to insult one another, not to talk to one another, not to compromise, right? Okay. That reminds that, well, Thrasymachus was doing something similar. Huh? So here's from the actual Republic itself. You have shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners, said Glaucon. They are like us, I replied, and they see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. So perhaps this brings us to the most striking feature of the prisoners, and that's that they do not even have access to their real selves. When a prisoner thinks about himself, what he's thinking about is an image that was constructed for him by someone else. Okay? So the experience of the self is a product of feelings, and the feelings are real, of course, but it's a product of feelings that have themselves been shaped and manipulated by rhetorical technique and excited into activity, right? For example, feelings of resentment and a desire for revenge in place of what otherwise might occur there if human nature were left uncorrupted, unmanipulated. Maybe feelings of compassion and a desire to get along. Who knows? So the emotions, particularly of envy, hatred, and vainglory, the competitive emotions, right, are those emotions addressed by the rhetorician, and this experience of self then becomes an experience of these competitive emotions that have a motivational element, right? I'll say there's this mystic, St. Catherine of Siena, and if I read that correctly, I believe she said that there's only a self at all where there's a person preoccupied with his or her own feelings and emotions. If you're not preoccupied with your own feelings and emotions, you're not a self. You're a person. It's better to be a person than a self, if you follow what I'm saying. Now, a person can still identify himself or herself, so I guess in that sense is a self. But I think St. Catherine of Siena was pointing out some important sort of distinction there, that there's really kind of division in our species, that of human beings, right? There are those who are preoccupied with their own feelings. That's probably the majority, right, guys? Unfortunately, they're preoccupied with them and practically worship them. And those persons are selves, okay? And there are persons who get their feelings under control, put them in perspective. And I think you can appreciate that too. You can't have a professional life unless you're able to do that to some degree, right? You can't drive a 70-foot truck on the basis of feeling. I did some work in that area. And people, generally speaking, people think of truckers as gruff, unpleasant people. They have one of the most difficult jobs out there, and they're amongst the most professional people you'll ever encounter. Now, some of them drive terribly and really should have their licenses taken away. I see that. I understand that. But the remainder, about 80% of them, are very professional, and they have their passions under control. Otherwise, they can't do what they're doing. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So maybe things aren't quite as bad. So if you want to become a person, get your commercial driver's license, Class A, and start driving along a big tractor trailer that'll induce you to give up being preoccupied with your feelings. It's not going to go too well in that particular area of work. So likewise, for being an electrician or a carpenter, you can't base your decision on how to use the circular saw on your feelings. Okay. So, and as they struggle with one another, they do so. Back in the slide now. As they struggle with one another, they do so in accordance with this manipulated image of self. But in striking at an image of another, of course, one actually strikes the real person. One has identified with the image. So I think I miscommunicated the idea. So when they struggle with one another, what they're fighting is another person, but in accordance with their image of that person, which has been introduced into their mind through rhetorical technique, right? Nonetheless, they strike the person. Usually it's a social blow, like we insult one another and damage one another socially. But there's a real person there, right? I mean, there's a real biological and moral entity there that gets harmed. All right. Now, one can push back against my interpretation. That's because the text actually offers something else. It says, quote, this entire allegory, this is Socrates again, this entire allegory, I said, you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument, the prison house in the world of sight, the light of fire, the prison house is the world of sight, the light of fire is the sun, and you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief, which, at your desire, I have expressed. Whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. So now here he says the fire is the sun, right? That's the interpretation I rejected earlier, but it's right there in the text. So you have pretty solid ground for saying, Dr. Shikiar, you're wrong, okay? I'm not going to give up yet. Let's hold on for a second. For my part, I wonder if this is not Socrates' accommodation, really, to Glaucon, and Plato testing his reader to see if he will make an independent effort to interpret the symbolism and discern a deeper truth. That's perfectly possible. Don't rule that out at all. We've already seen how Plato conceals things, guys, deliberately, right? The most important definition of justice in Book 1 wasn't even stated. He had to work to get it, okay? So don't be surprised. If he made you work to get the truth once, he might make you work to do it a second time, a third time, and so on. In any event, I submit that my interpretation, whatever Plato would think of it, does in fact state the truth or a truth about human experience. So one other feature of the allegory. And now look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. At first, when any one of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains. You may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? Incidentally, remember that Thrasymachus is from the city of the blind, right? So he can't apparently rise very high in the hierarchy of clarity given in the divided line. All right.
So, and if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes, which will make him turn away? And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent, and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what we are now calling realities. Okay. Who is it that is imparting instruction to the student here, who apparently is not having a very good time? So that has to be the Socratic philosopher, Socratic or Platonic philosopher. No one has explained where he's come from. Okay. So note that philosophical education here is represented as, first of all, unpleasant. Sorry if you're finding this unpleasant. And number two, as being experienced by the student as a kind of coercion. Right? Look at this phrase here. He is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent. Okay, so Greeks were not a toga, but a chaton. And so Socrates or some other philosopher grabs hold of this student's chaton and starts dragging the student up. It's male in this case. Starts dragging the young man up. I gave you the picture before, right? Where'd he go? Starts dragging the young man up this slope. Slowly, he's like, I don't want to do it. He gets dragged up there till finally he's out here, and now his eyes are in intense pain because he's not accustomed to the light. And he'll have to go through a series of steps, which we're not going to go through, in order to ever get to the point of seeing the sun or looking at the sun. Even anyone who's accustomed to living outside has a hard time looking at the sun and is advised not to do it. Okay. So, true education. From his allegory, Socrates infers a lesson concerning the true nature of education. Notice this is a typically Platonic point. It is that it involves inducing in the student the turning not of a part, but of the entire soul towards the idea of the good and the unchanging forms. Okay? So if we were to take Plato's advice here, the one thing needful would be to just turn your back on corporate media and corporate entertainment, which is all propaganda too. Turn your back on it entirely. Just get rid of basically cancel your cable TV subscription, and spend some period of time, say 5 to 10 years, devoting yourself single-mindedly, not to the public good, because that's what's gotten us in our predicament, right? Paying too much attention to politics, but studying the eternal truth. Okay, and then he'll give you a little curriculum about how you should go about doing that. Okay. So it follows that the turning of the whole soul, the epiagoge is what they call that, would prove painful even for those who possess an aptitude for and natural love of the truth. Well, Plato's not mincing his words. Philosophy is difficult. Okay, it's difficult. It's difficult business. He's revealing it was difficult for him. It was difficult for his master Socrates. It was difficult for his student Aristotle. Okay, the student Aristotle was certainly alive at the time that Plato published the Republic, and Plato was certainly aware of Aristotle's extraordinary intelligence, and he was going to have quite a lot of influence on people. So perhaps the transition from images to reality, right? Like when you basically a head full of false opinions that you love and identify with, to reality, that is opposite opinions, which you don't identify with. Perhaps that transition can be slow, painful, difficult, disorienting, and humiliating, and for some people, crushing. Okay? That's going to be a difficult process. What alternative is there? Okay, so some of you have seen the Matrix series. I can't remember if it was in Matrix Part 2 or Part 3, where one of the rebels who was trying to free humanity from the AI Borg that had taken control. You see how all these films kind of prepping people for this AI universe we're heading into. One fellow who was part of the human sort of freedom movement, he said, you know what, this is just too hard. I don't want to deal with something slow, painful, difficult, disorienting, and humiliating. I give up. I'm going to sell out my fellow human beings. I'm going to give the machines the address of Zion. That was their city down in the center of the earth here, or at least buried deep in the earth. And all I want in exchange is to get back in my pod. You can plug me in and then give me virtual everything, virtual steak, virtual wine. I'll be perfectly happy with that. I'd rather be dominated by machines, by wickedness, by anything, so long as I can live a life of pleasure. One day my body will expire naturally, and then I won't know anything further. So if he was an atheistic materialist, let's put it this way. Sounds like he was an atheistic materialist, right? If atheistic materialism is true, then even though we look upon his decision as base and indeed as treacherous, as an ugly betrayal, at least, you know, his choice could begin to have something resembling legs, right? You can say, okay, well, once you're dead, you're dead. But here's the rub. I mean, if theistic supernaturalism is true and all of your actions count, and they can't help but count for your eternal destiny, then doing what he did would be the wrong choice, to put it mildly. All right. So the fact that philosophy can be slow, painful, difficult, disorienting, and humiliating, and this is not to kind of dissuade you from studying philosophy. Hopefully, you're having a decent time. This would shed light on Socrates' statement in the Phaedo, another dialogue, that philosophy is the practice of death. The practice of what? The death of the self. As you give up opinions that you identified with, just bury them and adopt the ones that turn out to be true, or at least have more more considerations in their favor. Okay, that's it. You might say, you know, just independently of philosophy, that's a part of being a mature human being. Someone who could admit, you know, I was wrong. It's time for me to learn something new and become a better version of myself. You'll always be a better version of yourself to the degree that you give up what's false for what's true. So the good and rule. At 519b forward, Socrates returns to the central paradox, namely that the very education necessary to produce a just city would produce individuals who would regard a just city as a matter of little account. They say, oh, well, just city, just Schmitty. Who cares? For them, it would be far more important to maintain a small society of philosophers, albeit, of course, in an unjust city, provided that they could devote themselves to the higher calling of studying and knowing the good and the domain of the ideas. And I already had my reply to this in an earlier lecture, but let's go with this again. Let's follow this out again. Glaucon goes so far as to indicate that forcing the natural-born philosophers to rule would be injustice. Now, Socrates' answer is that persons who acquire their philosophical education at the expense of the state will owe the state their service. That makes sense. As it stands, a philosopher who, like Socrates, acquires his education despite what his city tried to do with him, owes that city exactly nothing, which can have a kind of a harsh ring to it. So apparently the Socrates in this dialogue thought he owed Athens precisely nothing. That's interesting. So how about my own case? You know, I'll be perfectly frank. I met a lot of resistance to pursuing the study of philosophy. But I can't say it was absolute resistance. I got my first, my undergraduate degree from a state school, and that was partially subsidized by tax dollars, right? So they maintained a philosophy department, and they paid their salaries, and the taxpayers of New York State partially covered my education in philosophy. So I guess I have nothing to complain about. And I do owe something back to the community because despite the opposition, there was also some support. So educating philosophers. One must devise an effective beginning in the education of philosophers. Okay, so some of you are wondering, how am I going to jettison MSNBC and Fox, and I guess I'll have to get rid of my Twitter account and social media, and stop watching Hollywood films or any films, even Bollywood. Get rid of the whole thing. Well, now what do I do? Now I'm just kind of sitting in my room not doing anything. Well, here's what you do. Okay, now it's time to make you into a philosopher. You have to pursue this. There's plenty of philosophy lectures on YouTube, and if you want, you're really serious about this, you can correspond with me. So first, one must have students reflect on paradoxes generated by sensation. That's one way you begin. For example, a man who is tall in one context is short in another. Okay, so I'm tall in comparison with my mother-in-law. I am short in comparison with Shaquille O'Neal. All right, guys? Yet tallness and shortness mutually repel one another. An intellectual solution is called for. So here we have certain properties are relative properties, right? Like tallness and shortness. Others are absolute properties. Okay, like being a definite height. So if you're 6 feet tall, you're 6 feet tall, period. Whether you call that tallness, right? I mean, if the 6 foot tall guy is hanging out in northern Minnesota, where everyone's 6'6", right? That doesn't count as tall over there, does it? If he's hanging out down in Peru, suddenly he's like a giant. Okay. So there are absolute properties and relative properties. See that? So we do that distinction, and now we're going into the realm of ideas and concepts. And there'd be a whole list of, dozens of paradoxes that one would encounter that you can draw from everyday life that would then thrust one into the realm of abstract conception. Okay, that's the basic idea. So second, arithmetic and geometry concern objects that have their residence in the realm of being. So we have to study mathematics because mathematics takes us out of becoming, and becoming, everything's changing. But in mathematics, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And that's the end of it, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4, it'll always equal 4. So you're outside of the realm of becoming when you start thinking mathematically. The sum of the interior angles of a triangle equals 180 degrees. And that's it. Okay, it'll always be that way. So you've just entered into the realm of being. So mathematics serves as a kind of ideal transition to the study of the ideas and eventually of the good. So in this connection, one might further observe that the order, symmetry, and definiteness to be encountered in mathematics provides initial indirect instruction, what might be called goodness. See, today you can open up a mathematics textbook and never encounter the concept good. Maybe they'll talk about a good proof or something like that. But as far as a mathematical theorem or a geometrical figure itself being good, that's not part of how mathematicians speak. Excuse me. Nonetheless, we do tend to take pleasure in things where we witness order, symmetry, definiteness, and mathematicians, in fact, do talk about the beauty of mathematics. It's a very commonly referred to feature of the whole science of mathematics and the mathematical relationships that they study. Okay? So what's beautiful is definitely good. So perhaps we have another transition to the idea of the good, that is, in the very objects of mathematics, because the good has left traces of itself in the mathematicals. So that's an interesting thought. Nonetheless, one must not allow them to become, that is, the students of philosophy in the Socratic city, in the beautiful city. We can't allow them to become full-time mathematicians, for the mathematician merely dreams about being, right? To quote Socrates, but haven't the capacity, that is, the mathematicians haven't the capacity to see it, that is, being in full awakeness. So my advisor paraphrased that and said, mathematicians dream about being awake. I mean, they take themselves to be awake, but they're not. I mean, a little bit of a jab against mathematicians. I don't have a low opinion of mathematicians. In fact, I admire them. And the mathematicians I've spoken to have been rather sensible. So to mathematics will naturally be joined the branches of applied mathematics, geometry and music, worth saying. But he makes a very interesting observation about astronomy. Oh, I said geometry and music. I mean astronomy and music, okay? Astronomy and music. May have to fix that. Hold on a second. You guys are probably getting sick of my typos. Let's do this. Right? We don't want geometry there. We want astronomy. Let's go ahead and put it in. There we go. And we'll save it. And do the slideshow again. Do it from the current slide. Oh, did I make a mistake? No, it's back. All right, but astronomy in particular, this is interesting, must be pursued with the caveat that the heavens suffer from the defect of all sensible beings. Namely, this might surprise you, a degree of disorder and instability. And we know today that over time, the relationships between the stars will shift slightly, right? And this has been observed because we have star charts from, remote antiquity. We might have some from the Babylonians or whatever. And we're able to compare those charts with what we have today. We see that there are slight differences. So things in the heavens move around, and we know that they do move around, don't they? Okay. Okay. So Plato was right about that, wasn't he? Yeah. Other thinkers in antiquity thought the stars were fixed in their positions. His student Aristotle thought that's the case. So that's a different physics and even a different metaphysics, believe it or not. So mathematicians argue from hypotheses which they assume to conclusions. I'll say it again. Mathematicians argue from hypotheses which they assume to conclusions they deduce through rigorous steps. Okay? But philosophers, so if any of you have studied any geometry, we assume that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. We just lay that down as a definition. Okay? And a curve is any other line other than connecting 2 points, right? Other than a straight line, other than the shortest distance between those 2 points. Okay? So, and that's putting aside for one moment infinite curves and infinite lines. Okay? So philosophers, by contrast, proceed dialectically from the hypotheses themselves upwards to the unhypothetical principle and down again to the ideas. Okay? That's the idea. No pun intended. So the mathematician begins from his hypotheses and deduces consequences, but the philosopher begins with those hypotheses, and he doesn't deduce consequences with dialectic, whatever that is. He proceeds up, sort of in a spiral, up to the unhypothetical principle. Most philosophers and readers of Plato identify that with the idea of the good. And then from there, he goes down to the ideas. So what is this philosophical dialectic? It'd be nice if we had a kind of technique for it, a description of it. So Socrates has no more than one, that it alone permits of an overview. Overview of what? An overview of everything. Okay, a synoptic vision of totality. The one thing the philosopher wants more than anything else, comprehensive knowledge. And then dialectic, one reasons from idea to idea by means of idea. That came earlier, book 6, I believe. One reasons from idea to idea by means of idea, but he doesn't give you any examples of how to do that. And the closest thing we get, I guess, would be the actual argumentation and dialogue in book 1, where they are considering ideas and they're examining ideas critically, okay, and rejecting bad ideas, and then arriving at better ideas. Maybe what he has in mind is simply, for example, is exemplified well by the exchange with Polemarchus. Polemarchus put forward the idea that justice is helping friends and harming enemies. Socrates then analyzed that idea, put pressure on it, and discovered that that can't be right. A better idea, as it were, would be justice is helping friends who both seem to be in our good and harming enemies who both seem to be in our bad. And then he put pressure on that definition, right? And found that you can't really harm anyone if you're thinking about harm in the strict sense of corrupting a person. So that justice has to be helping friends who seem to be good and are good and harming no one, right? Maybe that's what he has in mind. That could be. Okay, so that if we just proceed dialectically, that is, in accordance with the step-by-step progress of rigorously structured and executed philosophical dialogue, then that's what it is. It could be. Plato doesn't tell us, but that at least makes some sense, and one could develop that idea. So how do we found this city that Socrates has talked about? Now remember, the original idea of this dialogue was to get at a definition of justice, and a kind of a secondary question was, well, there are 3 questions really. What is justice? That's number 1. Second question, how can I know that if I devote myself to cultivating justice in my soul, that's going to make me happy. That's number two. And then the third question is closely related to the second. What argument can we make in favor of the just life over the unjust life, right? And then all that got diverted into this discussion of the Callipolis, the beautiful city, and the just city. And so the original sort of concern got lost sight of for a bit, while Socrates decided to describe this city he was constructing. Now, he had that natural city at the beginning with 4 or 5 men. He might have found that satisfying, but Glaucon forced him to expand that. And then we got books 2 through 4. And then we got a definition of justice, which we could ascribe to the soul. That is justice as minding one's own business. Okay, but Socrates himself then turned the question back to politics, because he was going to talk about the 4 corrupt regimes, which only get introduced in book 8, which we're not going to read together. And he gets interrupted again and compelled to go deeper into the constitution of the just city he has proposed. And then he talks about the 3 waves of paradox we talked about last time. And now philosophical education. And he had to ground all of this in this extraordinary metaphysics of the divided line and the idea of the good. Okay, so that's why we're talking about a city at all. Okay, the original idea was to figure out the nature of justice, how justice works in the soul, and how leading a just life would make you happier than if you're to be an unjust person. Okay, so in the Go, we've become interested in this idea of the just city, right? It has taken on its own momentum, and we're wondering, okay, independently of all the stuff about the soul, hey, what about the city, man? Okay, can we found this thing, right? It's become an independent object of interest. And notice how it's fascinating. And notice, I think you yourself and I myself, are now interested in the city and wonder if it could be founded. And that has become an almost independent concern apart from the just soul. Okay, we put all this effort into describing this thing. How do we found it? Whether it's just or not, how do we found this thing, right? Okay. So Socrates adds further details to his educational scheme. We merely remark that he apportions 15 years of study to his class of philosophers, sovereigns, because there are women there too. So it's not really philosopher kings. They're philosopher kings and queens. This is called philosopher sovereigns. It is only at the age of 50 that the most advanced student is led to the vision of the good. Immediately thereafter, he is compelled to rule. Okay, I described this in greater detail in a previous lecture, so we'll let it go. As for the founding of the city, Socrates says the following. Here we go. They will begin, that is Socrates and his lieutenants, they will begin by sending out into the country all the inhabitants of the city who are more than 10 years old, and will take possession of their children, who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws, in the laws which we have given them. And in this way, the state and constitution of which we were speaking will soonest and most easily attain happiness. And the nation which has such a constitution will gain most. Okay, that was supposed to be Socrates. I didn't do his voice. Yes, that will be the best way, says Glaucon. And I think Socrates, rather chipper about this idea, and I think, Socrates, that you will have very well described how, if ever, such a constitution might come into being. Okay, so how do you bring this constitution into being? Okay, if you guys are convinced, we all have to get into 2 or 3 vans. 4, how many people do we have? 4 vans. We have to drive over to East Greenwich, okay, and then go door to door, dragging the adults out, and we have to have some school buses or something. We force them into the school buses at gunpoint, and we drive them out to the fields. Okay, I'm not going to say what we do with them there. And then we keep all the kids under 10. So you're 11 and up. You're going on a school bus, and we drive you away to a concentration camp somewhere or whatever it may be. And then we take the kids and we raise them in our ways, and more or less put up a big wall around East Greenwich. And anybody tries to take the territory, we beat them back, raise up the kids, and then we have our just city. Of course, it wouldn't work, but that's the idea. So violence is necessary to found this city, folks. Okay, that's just what that means. That's what that means. And that, here's what I said, requires the abduction of the young and the liquidation of the adult population because, what are you going to drop them off in the countryside and just leave them there? I guess you could. Most of them would die. I mean, so it boils down to the same thing. Of course, in Rhode Island, none of this would go anywhere. In antiquity, maybe you could get away with some of this. As a matter of fact, when they built a polis in antiquity, they would take several villages, and a group of thugs would more or less force them to unite under a tyrant. So this is not an unfamiliar idea. But you note the problem. I mean, getting a bunch of thugs together is one thing. Socrates needs people devoted to his highly abstract and controversial philosophical city. So he needs people who aren't merely thugs. They have to be actually already raised up in his ways. But you don't get people raised up in his ways unless you already have a just city, right? So the just city presupposes the just city, so it would seem to be impossible. And that, my friends, is the end. Okay, so we're done with the Republic, and we will talk about Aristotle tomorrow.